Detective Julia Matthews stood in the cold, sterile forensic lab, staring at the evidence laid out before her. It was a case like many others, a violent murder, a gruesome crime scene, and a list of suspects who all seemed to have something to hide. But there was something different about this one, something that gnawed at the back of her mind. She couldn't put her finger on it, not yet, but she knew there was more to the case than anyone realized. The victim, Peter Dorsey, had been found in a rundown apartment on the edge of town, his body battered and bloodied, left in a way that suggested a personal vendetta. The initial investigation had been clean-cut, no sign of forced entry, no apparent struggle. Dorsey was a lawyer with a somewhat questionable past, a man who had made a lot of enemies over the years. His wife, Teresa, had been the first to discover the body, her hysterical 911 call, the only lead they had at first. The case seemed simple at first glance. A crime of passion. A robbery gone wrong. Maybe a disgruntled client had taken matters into their own hands. But as Julia delved deeper into the evidence, she began to realize that there was something more, something hidden beneath the surface. Julia had been working in homicide for nearly a decade, but this case felt different. The body had been meticulously staged, the scene unnervingly clean for a crime of passion. There were no fingerprints on the weapon, no signs of struggle, and the victim's phone had been wiped clean of any data. To the untrained eye, it looked like a botched robbery. But Julia knew better. She had seen too many cases like this, and her gut told her that the truth was more complicated than it seemed. She had spent days combing through the evidence, poring over photos and lab reports, but it wasn't until she returned to the scene for the 5th time that something caught her attention. It was small, almost insignificant, but it struck her like a bolt of lightning. A single smudge of dust on the windowsill, barely visible to the naked eye, but enough to raise a flag in her mind. Julia couldn't explain it, but it didn't sit right with her. The apartment had been thoroughly cleaned, everything in place, no sign of a struggle, yet there was that one smudge. It looked like someone had brushed against the sill while moving something, but nothing had been disturbed. It was a detail that, in most cases, would be overlooked. But for Julia, it was the thread that unraveled the whole case. She knew that the smallest clue could be the key to solving the entire puzzle. And so, she set to work, determined to follow this lead wherever it took her. But her obsession with the tiny detail didn't sit well with her superiors. The case was already starting to feel like a dead end, and the department was under increasing pressure to close it quickly. There was a sense of urgency, a desire to put this case behind them and move on to the next one. Her captain, James Hall, had already given her the green light to close the case, but Julia couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. She had learned long ago that rushing to close a case often meant missing vital evidence, and she wasn't about to let that happen again. "Julia, we need to wrap this up," Captain Hall said, his voice firm. "The press is breathing down our necks. We're running out of time. We don't need to waste resources on a case that's already been solved." Julia stood her ground. "There's something here, Captain. I can feel it. The smudge on the windowsill, there's no way it's just an accident." Captain Hall's eyes narrowed. "You're chasing ghosts, Matthews. The evidence points to a robbery gone wrong. We have a confession from the wife, the motive is clear. This case is done." But Julia wasn't ready to give up. She dug deeper, revisiting the scene, re-interviewing witnesses, and going over every detail with a fine-tooth comb. And it was during one of these late-night sessions, when everyone else had gone home, that she discovered something even more crucial. The smudge on the windowsill wasn't just a sign of someone brushing against it. It was a fingerprint. A partial print that had been left behind in the most unlikely place. The print wasn't a match to anyone in the system, but it was enough to tell Julia that they were looking in the wrong direction. With renewed determination, Julia began tracing the origins of the print. She spent hours in the lab, running tests, comparing data, and cross-referencing every possible lead. As she dug deeper, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The print didn't match any of the usual suspects, but it did match someone who had been involved in the case years ago, a man named Paul Turner, a former associate of Peter Dorsey. Turner had a long history with Dorsey. They had once been close friends, working together on several high-profile cases, but their relationship had soured years earlier, after a bitter falling out over a business deal gone wrong. Turner had been implicated in several shady dealings over the years, but nothing had ever stuck. Julia knew that Turner had disappeared from the public eye after the fallout with Dorsey, but she had always assumed he had moved on. She never imagined he would resurface now, and certainly not in connection with a murder. The more Julia learned about Turner, the more she began to suspect that he was the key to solving the case. But when she tried to approach her superiors with this new information, she was met with resistance. They were determined to close the case quickly, to put it to bed before it could generate any more media attention. Julia's persistence, however, only deepened the captain's frustrations. He insisted that she focus on the obvious leads, the wife, the motive, the financial troubles, anything to wrap it up and move on. But Julia couldn't let it go. She knew that Turner was involved, and she knew that the tiny forensic detail on the windowsill was just the beginning. With no help from the department, she took matters into her own hands and went after Turner herself. After days of tracking leads and piecing together information, Julia finally found Turner in a seedy part of town, hiding in a rundown motel. He was living under an alias, trying to stay off the radar, but Julia wasn't going to let him slip away. She confronted him, and at first, he denied everything. But the pressure mounted, and the truth finally came out. Turner had been back in town for months, watching Dorsey from the shadows. He had been enraged when Dorsey's new law firm had started to outpace his own, and he had become obsessed with the idea of taking Dorsey down. The murder had been meticulously planned. He had studied Dorsey's habits, learning his routines, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But he had made a critical mistake. He had left behind the smudge on the windowsill. A single, overlooked detail that Julia had seized upon and turned into the breakthrough she needed. Turner's motive was as petty as it was tragic: jealousy, greed, and a sense of betrayal. He had blamed Dorsey for his downfall, convinced that his former friend had stolen his clients and ruined his career. In the end, it wasn't about the money or the business, it was about revenge. Turner had killed Dorsey in cold blood, staging the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. But he had overlooked one crucial detail, and that was his undoing. With Turner arrested and the case finally solved, Julia stood in the precinct, looking at the evidence one last time. She had done it. She had cracked the case. It hadn't been easy. It had taken patience, determination, and an unwavering belief that the smallest detail could hold the key to the truth. Despite the pressure from her superiors, despite the doubts and frustrations, Julia had followed the evidence wherever it led. And in the end, it had been worth it. The case had been closed, but the lessons learned would stay with her forever. In the world of forensic investigation, it was easy to overlook the small things. But Julia knew that the smallest clue could be the difference between a case solved and a killer left free. And as long as she was a detective, she would never forget that lesson.